They always said it with a laugh, like the joke belonged to the room and not to his skin. 30 already? Still no alpha? Some people just aren't chosen. Aurelian Pike stood near the kitchen doorway with his hands folded in front of him, posture calm, expression neutral, pleasant enough to be ignored. It was a talent he'd learned early: become background without becoming bitter. Let people fill the silence with whatever they needed to believe about you. The reunion house was too warm, crowded with bodies and old stories, the kind of warmth that wasn't comfort, just density. Voices stacked over voices, clinking glasses, the familiar rhythm of relatives proving they still knew where everyone belonged. Aurelian belonged in the doorway, not seated at the main table, not leaned in with the cousins who compared engagement rings like performance metrics, not pulled into the orbit of the younger Omegas, who kept checking their phones for texts from alphas they'd learned to call protective, even when the protection looked like surveillance. He belonged where people could pass him without making room. He watched himself do it without resentment. He'd become good at reading air, good at recognizing when the room's mood was shifting and smoothing it before it sharpened into something uglier. He'd done the shopping run earlier because no one else remembered who was allergic to walnuts. He'd fixed the coffee machine because his uncle would rather complain than repair. He'd rearranged the seating so two cousins with a history of shouting weren't placed close enough to trigger old patterns. Hyper-competent, quietly essential, still invisible. The kitchen smelled like roasted meat and sweetness. Someone had overdone the cinnamon in the dessert, and it made the air taste heavy. Aurelian poured water into a pitcher that didn't need refilling, a task that made his hands look occupied, like he had somewhere to put his attention besides the inevitable. His aunt's voice cut through the noise with practiced brightness. "Aurelian, sweetheart, come here." He turned without hesitation. He didn't pretend he hadn't heard. Pretending made them louder. Compliance kept things brief. His aunt kissed his cheek the way people kissed objects that belonged to the family but weren't particularly treasured. She held him at arm's length and looked him up and down. "Still no one?" she asked, smiling. "At your age?" Aurelian met her eyes. "Still no one," he said lightly. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole story. A cousin leaned over from the counter, mouth curved in amusement. "Maybe he's waiting for the perfect alpha," she teased, "or maybe the perfect alpha is waiting for someone else." Laughter rippled. Not cruel enough to be called cruelty, clean enough to be defended as family banter, surgical enough to leave an incision every time. Aurelian's mother smiled too, a tight expression that looked like politeness but felt like relief. Relief that the attention wasn't on her. Relief that the room still agreed on who Aurelian was allowed to be, a cautionary tale with good manners. He nodded once, like he'd been included. "Maybe," he said. They lost interest quickly. Mockery only entertained when it drew blood. Aurelian didn't bleed in public anymore. He'd learned that giving people a reaction was like signing a contract. Once you offered it, they could ask for it again. He returned to the doorway. From there, he could see everything without being dragged into it. The younger Omegas gathered in a half circle near the living room, showing each other pictures. One of them laughed too loudly at a joke an alpha texted, then checked the room to make sure someone important had noticed. The alphas present, married in, engaged, paired, stood in clusters near the patio doors like they were guarding exits that didn't need guarding. Their dominance was loud even when they whispered. Aurelian wondered, not for the first time, if pairing early made people brave or just practiced at calling possession romance. He looked away before the thought could settle into bitterness. He caught his own reflection in the kitchen window, dark hair neatly cut, collar straight, expression composed. 30 years old, omega-coded in the way their world measured it. Gentler scent profile, softer features, the kind of presence people assumed they could manage. Manageable. That word had followed him through his 20s like a shadow, not spoken aloud, but threaded through compliments. "You're so calm. You're so low maintenance. You don't make things difficult." Aurelian had taken those compliments like proof he was doing life correctly. Now he heard them for what they were: training. He turned his gaze back to the room and felt the familiar small ache beneath his ribs, steady as a second pulse. It wasn't loneliness. It was recognition, reaching for something it couldn't name. Every night, without fail, he dreamed of the same man, Not a different face each time, not a vague blur shaped by hope. The same, a tall alpha, calm presence, hands scarred in a way that suggested survival rather than violence, eyes that looked like recognition instead of judgment. The alpha never spoke in the dreams. He didn't demand. He didn't claim. He simply stayed, close enough to be felt, never close enough to take. In those dreams, Aurelian never felt watched. He felt held, and when he woke, the ache wasn't longing. It was familiarity, like memory catching up to reality at its own slow pace. He'd tried to dismiss it at first. Stress, imagination, the brain's lazy habit of turning emptiness into pattern. He worked in archives. He understood how minds clung to repetition. He understood how people rewrote stories until they could live inside them. But the dreams didn't feel like stories. They felt like contact. Some mornings, he woke with the faint sense of warmth on his wrist, as if a hand had been there. Some mornings, he woke already calm, like someone else's steadiness had leaked into his body overnight. Once, he woke with the faint metallic scent of rain and leather in his nose, so sharp he sat up and checked his room for an open window. There hadn't been one. He didn't tell anyone. Not because he was ashamed, but because he refused to hand his private hope to people who enjoyed turning tenderness into entertainment. Still, the family had noticed the shift in him anyway. People always did. Not the deep things, but the surface changes. An eased mouth, a softer gaze, the tiny reduction of tension in his shoulders. They noticed because it threatened their story about him. If Aurelian stopped looking like a warning, what would they do with the years they'd spent using him as one? His aunt's eyes narrowed as she watched him refill the same pitcher again. "You've been smiling more," she said, voice sharp under the sweetness. "What's that about?" Aurelian froze for half a second, then smoothed it away. "Nothing. Nothing," she repeated, skeptical. "At your age, nothing is suspicious." His mother's gaze flicked toward him, then away, as if she didn't want to participate, but didn't want to stop it either. Aurelian set the pitcher down carefully. Glass clinked against counter. A tiny sound, but it landed inside him like a decision. "I've been sleeping better," he said. "Oh?" a cousin said, interest sharpening like a blade. "Found someone?" "No," Aurelian replied. The room leaned in, barely. Hope is always more interesting when it might be humiliated. Aurelian kept his voice even. "I've been dreaming." Silence, then laughter. Quick and relieved, the kind of laughter people use to restore their sense of superiority. "Dreaming?" his aunt echoed. "Of what? An alpha finally showing up to save you?" Aurelian's throat tightened. Not from embarrassment, from something else, an instinctive protectiveness he didn't fully understand. "I don't need saving," he said calmly. That should have ended it. It didn't. 30 and imaginary mates, someone muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Careful," another added. "That's how people end up alone for good." "Delusional," his aunt said softly, like the word was a diagnosis she was offering for free. The cruelty stayed measured, surgical. No shouting, no slurs, just a steady pressure designed to make Aurelian doubt his own interior world, designed to make him apologize for hope. Aurelian smiled, polite and empty, and picked up a stack of plates that didn't need moving. He carried them to the sink, hands steady, because if he stayed still too long, they might see what the words had hit. His palms were damp. He focused on the sound of running water, on the sensation of porcelain under his fingers, on the calm he'd learned to manufacture when rooms tried to shrink him. He had chosen patience as strength. He had chosen solitude instead of bruised bonds. He had chosen not to perform desperation for an audience that called that virtue. And yet, standing there, he felt the old question rise anyway, quiet and dangerous. If waiting didn't make him unworthy, why did they need it to? He turned off the tap and looked out through the kitchen doorway again. Everyone had already moved on. That was the cruelty's final trick. Hurt you, then act as if your pain is your private problem. Aurelian wiped his hands and excused himself without making a scene. He walked down the hall and stepped into the small guest room that smelled of dust and fabric softener. He closed the door and leaned his forehead against it, breathing slowly until his heartbeat stopped trying to outrun him. In the quiet, the ache returned, not sharper, but clearer. Familiarity, presence, as if somewhere someone had noticed the wound being opened again. He didn't know why that thought felt true. He only knew it did. If you're still listening, ask yourself something. When family laughs at your loneliness, what exactly are they protecting? Your future or their comfort? And if belonging requires you to be smaller, is it belonging at all? Or just a room that prefers you quiet? Aurelian straightened, smoothed his shirt, and returned to the noise with his dignity intact. Later that night, when the reunion house finally emptied into exhausted silence, he would fall asleep and drift toward the same dream. He would find the Alpha again, and he would learn slowly, precisely, that some kinds of waiting weren't weakness. They were a refusal to be claimed by the wrong hands. Aurelian learned patience the way other people learned ambition, early, quietly, and with consequences no one warned him about. It wasn't that he had never been wanted. That was the story people preferred because it made his solitude feel deserved. The truth was messier and less convenient. He had been wanted plenty of times, just never on terms that left him intact. In his early 20s, there had been offers dressed up as certainty. Alphas who liked his calm because it made them feel larger by contrast, who praised his low needs as if it were a virtue instead of a warning sign. They spoke about the future with a confidence that never included questions. "You'd fit well with me," one had said once, like Aurelian was a piece of furniture. Another had smiled kindly and explained that pairing would stabilize him, as if his unpaired state were a condition to be corrected rather than a choice. Aurelian had listened. He always listened, and then he had declined. Not dramatically, not with speeches about autonomy or dignity, just a simple, steady no that confused people who were used to Omega's translating refusal into apology. Each time, the response followed a pattern: surprise, then irritation, then a careful reframe that made his choice sound like fear. "You'll regret waiting," they'd said. "Don't be unrealistic. Time isn't kind to Omegas." Aurelian had nodded politely and let them believe whatever story made leaving easier. Waiting for him was not inertia. It was discernment. He built a life that didn't depend on being chosen. Archival work suited him. Quiet rooms, careful handling, the satisfaction of preserving things people forgot to value until they were gone. He liked the way history required patience, the way it rewarded attention instead of speed. He walked the same routes every evening, not because he lacked imagination, but because repetition calmed him. He learned which streets softened at dusk, which corners held noise too long. He chose his favorite cafe because the owner never asked personal questions and remembered his order without making a show of it. Solitude, chosen, felt different from isolation. Still, the dreams came. At first, they were faint impressions, shadows of presence more than images, a sense of someone standing close without crowding, the subtle shift of air when another body entered the room, comfort that didn't require explanation. Then they sharpened. The Alpha's hands were the first detail to resolve fully. Scarred, not dramatically, but with the accumulated marks of survival. Burns that had healed cleanly, old cuts that suggested work rather than recklessness. Hands that knew restraint. Aurelian noticed the way those hands never reached for him unless he moved closer first. That detail stayed with him long after waking. The Alpha's face followed. Strong lines softened by stillness. Eyes that didn't search Aurelian for weaknesses or worth. They simply met his gaze, steady and unafraid of what they might find there. In the dreams, there was no urgency, no claim, no countdown clock reminding Aurelian he was running out of time. The Alpha never spoke, but his presence felt communicative in a way words often failed to be. Like an understanding already reached somewhere deeper than language. When Aurelian woke, the ache wasn't sharp. It was gentle and persistent, like a muscle remembering work it was meant to do. He tried, at first, to explain it away. Dreams were the mind's way of rehearsing unmet needs. He knew the research. He could cite it if he wanted to. But knowing explanations didn't dissolve the experience. Some mornings, he woke calmer than he'd gone to sleep, as if someone else's steadiness had anchored him through the night. Other mornings, he woke unsettled, heart heavy with a grief that didn't have a clear source, the kind of grief that felt like loss without event. He began to write the dreams down, not in detail, not like a story, but in fragments: scarred hands, stillness, rain smell, leather, recognition before sight. He didn't read the notes back. Writing them was enough, a way to acknowledge without indulging. Waiting, he reminded himself, was strength. He had built his life around that belief. It was only after the reunion jokes started again, after the laughter sharpened and hope was punished, that the dreams changed. That night, the Alpha looked worried. It was subtle, barely there, but Aurelian felt it immediately. The calm presence he'd grown used to was still steady, but there was tension beneath it, like a held breath. The Alpha's gaze searched his face in a way it never had before. Distance crept into the dream. Not separation, not absence, but space that hadn't existed before, stretching thin and cold. Aurelian took a step forward, instinctive, and the Alpha mirrored him, not retreating, just delayed, as if something external was interfering. Aurelian woke with his heart racing, sheets twisted around his legs. The room felt wrong, emptier than usual. He sat up and pressed his palm to the mattress beside him, grounding himself in the reality of fabric and weight. For the first time, he felt afraid of losing something that had never been promised. The fear followed him into the day. He caught himself drifting, attention snagging on nothing. At work, he misfiled a document and had to correct it later, the small error unsettling him more than it should have. On his evening walk, the usual calm failed to arrive, replaced by a restless sense of anticipation. Waiting, suddenly, didn't feel like strength. It felt like risk. That realization unsettled him deeply. Because Aurelian had always trusted waiting, it had been his shield against desperation, his refusal to accept bonds that bruised. If waiting could hurt him too, then what ground was left to stand on? He sat on a bench as the sky darkened and watched people pass. Paired alphas and omegas moving in familiar orbits, their gestures practiced, their dynamics visible even at a distance. Some looked content, some looked constrained, most looked tired. Aurelian wondered how many of them had chosen their bonds freely, and how many had chosen them because time had frightened them into settling. He thought of his family's laughter, of the way 30 had been turned into an accusation instead of a fact, of how easily patience was reframed as failure when it threatened other people's choices. He went home and slept poorly. The dreams returned, but thinner, like a signal struggling through interference. The Alpha was still there, but quieter, his presence strained. Aurelian woke with a decision settling slowly in his chest. He would not chase the dream. He would not force meaning onto it to soothe his fear. But he would stop dismissing it as fantasy designed to humiliate him. Waiting didn't mean erasing his own experience. It meant trusting himself enough not to panic. That morning, he brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the city wake. He let the ache exist without naming it longing or delusion. He let the familiarity sit beside him like an unanswered question that didn't need to be punished for existing. Whatever the dreams were, memory, intuition, coincidence, they had not made him smaller. They had made him more himself. And if the world insisted on calling that foolish, then perhaps the world was invested in omegas, never learning the difference between patience and surrender. Aurelian finished his tea and stood. He would continue to wait. Not because he was afraid of being alone, but because he refused to be rushed into a life that required him to disappear in order to belong. Aurelian didn't tell his family about the dreams. He hadn't planned to tell them at all, but families noticed change the way predators noticed limps. Not the cause, just the deviation. A softened mouth, a steadier breath, the way he no longer flinched when the jokes landed. Hope, it turned out, was visible. It showed up in the smallest betrayals of habit. He hummed while washing dishes. He lingered in rooms instead of slipping out early. He laughed once, actually laughed, at a story that wasn't cruel, and the sound startled even him. His aunt noticed first. "You've been smiling again," she said, not warmly. Her eyes sharpened like she'd spotted a loose thread. "Who are you seeing?" Aurelian set his mug down carefully. "No one." The word no landed heavier than it should have. "Then what is it?" she pressed. "New job? New friends?" "No," he said again, gentler this time. "Just sleeping better." The room tilted, imperceptibly. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. The social machinery adjusted, seeking an angle. His cousin leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You don't just start sleeping better at 30, she said lightly. "What's the secret?" Aurelian hesitated, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew the cost of offering truth to people who used it as sport. Still, something in him was tired of hiding neutral things like they were crimes. "I've been dreaming," he said. Silence fell. Not the empty kind, but the anticipatory kind. The kind that leaned forward. "Dreaming?" his aunt echoed, a smile already forming. "About what?" Aurelian met her gaze. "About someone." Laughter broke loose like glass shattering. Too loud, too fast. "Oh, that's rich," someone said. "An imaginary alpha?" another added. "At his age?" His mother laughed too, a thin sound she probably told herself was kindness. "Aurelian, sweetheart, dreams aren't substitutes for real life." The words were meant to sound practical. They felt surgical. Aurelian felt something tighten in his chest. Not embarrassment, not exactly. More like a reflexive protection, as if they were reaching for something fragile, and he had stepped between it and harm without thinking. "I'm not substituting anything," he said calmly. "Careful," his aunt said, voice dropping into something almost gentle. "That's how people end up alone for good, clinging to fantasies instead of accepting reality." There it was, the threat dressed as advice. Aurelian nodded once. "Thank you for your concern." It should have ended there. He'd given them the exit, polite, controlled, bloodless. They didn't take it. 30 and delusional, someone muttered. "Imaginary mates," another said, shaking their head. "Sad," his aunt concluded softly, like a verdict. The cruelty stayed measured. No raised voices, no dramatic insults, just enough pressure to make him doubt his own interior life, to make him feel foolish for warmth that hadn't been approved. Hope, he realized, was not forgiven unless it was sanctioned. Aurelian picked up his plate and carried it to the sink. The clatter of porcelain against metal was too loud in the quiet that followed. His hands shook, just slightly. He focused on the temperature of the water, the weight of the dish, the rhythm of a task that asked nothing of him. He told himself not to react. He had practiced this for years, but something inside him had shifted, and the old strategies didn't fit as well anymore. The jokes didn't slide off, they pressed. They reached toward the place where the dreams lived and tried to turn it into shame. That night, Aurelian dreamed differently. The alpha was there, as always, but the air between them felt strained, like a held note that couldn't resolve. The calm presence remained, but it was threaded with worry. The alpha's eyes searched Aurelian's face, not with judgment, but with urgency, as if something had gone wrong. Aurelian stepped forward. "I'm here," he tried to say, but his voice didn't carry the way it usually did in the dream. The alpha lifted a hand, not to stop him, but to steady him, and the space between them stretched. Distance appeared, not emptiness, not absence, interference. Aurelian woke with a sharp inhale, heart racing, the sheets twisted around his legs. The room felt colder than it should have been. He sat up and pressed his palm to his chest, breathing until the panic loosened its grip. For the first time, he felt afraid that the dreams could be taken from him. That fear followed him into the day like a shadow. At work, he reread the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it. On his walk home, he flinched at sudden noises, a sensitivity he hadn't felt in years. He kept thinking of the alpha's expression, concern without blame, distance without rejection. It wasn't abandonment, it was warning. Aurelian stopped on a bridge overlooking the river and rested his hands on the railing. The water moved steadily below, indifferent to human timelines. He wondered when hope had become something that needed permission. He understood suddenly why his family reacted the way they did. If Aurelian could wait and not be broken by it, if he could be 30 and still whole, then their rush looked less like wisdom and more like fear. His patience threatened the story they told themselves about compromise being maturity. Hope was dangerous when it refused to behave. That realization steadied him. He went home and lit a lamp instead of sitting in the dark. He brewed tea and let it cool while he stared out the window. He didn't try to summon the dream. He didn't try to push it away either. Waiting, he reminded himself, did not mean self-erasure. It meant refusing to let other people name his interior life. That night, the dream returned. Still strained, still quiet, but the alpha was there. The presence held. The distance didn't grow. Aurelian woke with a familiar ache and a new clarity. Whatever the dreams were, they mattered. And if the world punished him for having hope that didn't beg or hurry, then the punishment said more about the world than it did about him. If you're still listening, ask yourself this. When hope is mocked out of you, who benefits from your resignation? And how many choices in your life were framed as realistic simply because someone else needed you to stop waiting? Aurelian rose with the morning light and dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but to remind himself that he existed beyond the punchlines. He didn't know yet that the interference was about to end. He only knew that he would not apologize for listening to something that felt truer than laughter ever had. Kadrin Holt learned long ago that rushing was a confession. People hurried when they needed to be seen, when they needed control fast because they didn't trust it to hold. Power that lasted moved differently, slow, deliberate, confident enough to wait for the room to catch up. Kadrin had built his life around that principle. He wasn't the loudest alpha in any room. He didn't posture. He didn't announce arrival with heat or threat. He let doors open because they had already been told to. He let conversations bend toward him because people sensed where decisions would eventually settle. That was why he noticed the pattern. It wasn't mystical, it wasn't romantic, it was structural. For months, he'd been tracking a disturbance in his own internal rhythm, dreams that didn't feel like projections, intuitions that arrived fully formed instead of speculative, a presence that registered as familiar without context. The same Omega, night after night, appearing not as fantasy, but as recognition. Kadrin had questioned himself first. He trusted skepticism more than hope. He mapped stressors, checked sleep cycles, cross-referenced trauma responses. He understood how the mind stitched meaning where it wanted relief. But the dreams didn't behave like wish fulfillment. They didn't escalate. They didn't ask. They stayed. And then, 3 weeks ago, the signal sharpened, not emotionally, somatically. He woke with the unmistakable sense that something external had shifted, like interference clearing from a frequency he'd been tuning for without realizing it. The Omega in the dream looked unsettled, guarded, hurt in a way that wasn't new but had been reopened. Someone had punished him for hoping. That was when Kadrin stopped treating the pattern as internal. He began to trace it outward, not names, not faces. He followed absence, unpaired Omegas past the age where society stopped pretending patience was respectable. People who had not rushed, people who had refused bonds that required them to become smaller. There were not many. The world trained Omegas early to fear waiting. One profile held longer than the rest. Aurelian Pike, 30, archivist. No pairing history worth noting. Family network that fit a familiar pattern. Loud affection, quiet cruelty, jokes that functioned as discipline. A life built carefully away from spectacle. Kadrin did not contact him. That mattered. If this was real, if the synchronization meant anything, it would collapse under force. Consent couldn't be manufactured. Recognition couldn't be coerced. So Kadrin waited. He observed from distance, through neutral channels, through data that didn't require intrusion. He watched patterns align, sleep disturbances, micro shifts in routine, the way Aurelian's emotional baseline changed after certain family gatherings. Interference. The same night Kadrin dreamed of distance, Aurelian had been mocked for hope. That was enough. Kadrin chose approach, not immediately, not dramatically, but precisely when presence would clarify instead of overwhelm. The reunion appeared on the calendar through a public listing, a harmless detail most people would ignore. Kadrin did not. He arrived without entourage, without display. He parked beyond the gate and walked in like someone who knew where he was going. The air adjusted around him, not because he demanded it, but because bodies recognized threat and safety before intellect caught up. He scanned the yard once, dismissed everyone. Then his gaze locked onto Aurelian Pike standing near the edge of the gathering, posture controlled, eyes alert in the way of someone used to being underestimated. Recognition hit them both at the same time. Kadrin felt it settle in his chest, calm, steady, undeniable, not desire, alignment. He did not rush. He crossed the yard at an unhurried pace, letting the room register the shift without explaining it. Conversations thinned, laughter faltered. People sensed that something had arrived that didn't need their permission. Kadrin stopped at a respectful distance. "Sorry to interrupt," he said evenly, voice carrying without force. "I'm looking for someone." Aurelian's mother laughed nervously, stepping forward on reflex. "And you are?" Kadrin didn't look at her. "I'm Kadrin Holt," he said. and I believe you've been speaking for someone who belongs to himself. Silence fell, not shock, recalibration. Kedron turned his attention fully to Aurelian then, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment private without excluding witnesses. I didn't come to claim you, he said. I came to ask if you wanted to speak. Aurelian's breath caught, not because he was chosen, because he was asked. For the first time, the dreams made sense, not as fantasy, but as a system finding its counterpart. Kadrin waited. Waiting, he knew, was the only way to keep choice intact. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured. Thin, hairline cracks spreading through the yard as people tried to decide whether what they were feeling was embarrassment, threat, or curiosity. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Laughter died mid-breath. Someone cleared their throat like sound might restore order. It didn't. Aurelian felt the shift in his body before his mind caught up. The familiar calm from his dreams settled into his chest, heavier now, anchored by gravity instead of imagination. His hands tingled, not with nerves, but with recognition, like a door he'd been leaning against for years had finally opened from the other side. Kadrin Holt stood there as if he'd always belonged in the space, not claiming it, occupying it. The difference mattered. His aunt recovered first. She always did. Adaptation was her strongest skill. Well, she said brightly, stepping closer, if you're a friend of the family, I'm not, Kadrin replied gently. The word gently did more damage than hostility ever could have. It stripped her of leverage without insulting her, left her nowhere to push without revealing herself. A cousin laughed too loudly. You must be here about the land dispute. No, Kadrin said again, still patient. Eyes began to turn toward Aurelian then, some curious, some irritated, some sharpened with the sudden awareness that the joke might have shifted hands. Aurelian swallowed. Every instinct told him to deflect, to make this easier for them, to laugh it off before the room decided he was responsible for its discomfort. He didn't. Kadrin's gaze stayed on him, not demanding, not rescuing, just steady, present, an invitation that didn't collapse into expectation. I believe, Kadrin said, voice carrying just enough to be heard, that you've been answering questions meant for someone else. Aurelian's mother bristled. We're just teasing. Family jokes. Kadrin finally looked at her. Not coldly, accurately. Jokes don't require witnesses, he said, and they don't need repetition to land. The air tightened. Aurelian felt heat rise in his face, not shame, but something unfamiliar and electric. For years he'd absorbed the tone of these gatherings like weather, convinced it was easier to endure than confront. Hearing it named without cruelty made it suddenly visible for what it was. A pattern. Kadrin turned back to him. You don't have to explain anything, he said quietly, but I'd like to hear your voice. The simplicity of it almost undid him. Aurelian opened his mouth, then closed it again. His heart hammered, not with fear, but with the weight of choice. If he spoke now, the family story would shatter. If he didn't, it would continue unchallenged. 30 years of silence pressed against the moment. He breathed in. I'm Aurelian, he said. His voice was steady. And I don't need anyone speaking for me. The words landed like a reset button. A ripple moved through the yard, some startled, some impressed, some resentful. His aunt's smile faltered. His mother's gaze dropped, then lifted again with something like confusion, as if she were seeing him for the first time without the frame she'd built around him. Kadrin inclined his head once, not approval, recognition. I came, Kadrin said, addressing the group now without raising his voice. Because when people are punished for waiting, it's rarely about patience. It's about control. Someone scoffed. You don't know our family. I know the pattern, Kadrin replied. I've watched it repeat in rooms like this for decades. Aurelian felt his chest expand with a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that someone else could see it. Fear of what visibility might cost him. Kadrin continued, unhurried. I didn't come to take him. I came to ask if he wanted me. Every eye snapped back to Aurelian. The punchline now held the room. He felt the weight of it, not crushing, but clarifying. The choice was his, publicly and without cushioning. No scripts, no apologies, no dramatic rescue to hide behind. Yes, he said. The certainty surprised even him. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The shock wasn't Cadron's presence. It was Aurelian's clarity. His aunt's mouth opened, then closed. His cousin stared at her phone like it had betrayed her. His mother looked stricken, not with loss, but with the realization that the version of her son she'd managed was no longer available. Kedron waited. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach out. He let the words settle into the space it had earned. I'm going to get my coat, Aurelian said after a moment. Cadron nodded. Take your time. That detail, take your time, lodged itself deep. Aurelian walked back into the house alone. His steps felt unreal, like he'd crossed an invisible line, and the floor no longer behaved the same way. In the hallway mirror, he caught his reflection again. He looked the same, and entirely different. When he returned, coat folded over his arm, the family had found their voices again. Apologies rushed, laughter forced, sudden respect blooming too late to feel sincere. Wait, his aunt said. We didn't mean. Aurelian met her gaze calmly. I know what you meant. He didn't wait for her response. Outside the gate, Cadron opened the car door and paused. Not ushering, not leading, offering. No one owns you, Cadron said softly. Not even me. Aurelian smiled. Not because he'd been chosen, but because for the first time he had been seen. The drive away from the reunion was quiet, not awkward, not heavy, intentional. Kedron didn't fill the space with reassurance or explanation. He drove with the steady focus of someone who understood that silence could be a gift when it wasn't being used as punishment. The city lights thinned as they moved farther out, the noise dissolving into distance. Aurelian watched his reflection in the window shift with the passing street lamps. His pulse hadn't slowed yet, but it wasn't racing either. It felt aligned, like his body had finally decided which direction to face. You don't have to say anything, Cadron said after a while. I know, Aurelian replied. The acknowledgement felt important. Choice again, always choice. They stopped at a quiet overlook where the city fell away into dark water and low hills. Cadron turned off the engine but didn't get out. He waited. Aurelian exhaled slowly. You didn't come to rescue me. No, Cadron agreed. You didn't humiliate them. No. You didn't even touch me. Cadron's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile, but something close. Power that needs witnesses isn't stable, he said. I wasn't there for them. Aurelian nodded. He understood that instinctively. He'd lived under power that demanded acknowledgement his whole life. What you said about patterns, Aurelian continued, about waiting being punished. Cadron glanced at him. It's efficient, he said. If you make patience look like failure, people rush into structures that benefit others. It keeps systems fed. Aurelian let that settle. It reframed years of advice, years of jokes disguised as concern, years of being told he was late. I didn't know if the dreams were real, Aurelian admitted. I was afraid they were just my mind filling space. They were real, Cadron said calmly, but not in the way people expect. He didn't frame it as fate. He didn't call it destiny. He spoke like someone describing architecture. When people suppress autonomy long enough, Cadron continued, their nervous systems start searching for alignment. Not dominance, not rescue, recognition. The dreams were your body saying there's another way to exist. Aurelian swallowed. And you? Cadron's gaze stayed forward. Mine were telling me not to rush. That answer landed harder than romance ever could have. They got out of the car and leaned against the railing overlooking the water. The wind was cool, clean. Aurelian folded his coat around himself without thinking. A second later, Cadron stepped closer, not touching, just close enough to block the wind. Protective, not possessive. I don't want to disappear into someone else's life, Aurelian said quietly. I've done that before. Not in a bond, but in a family. Cadron nodded once. Then don't, he said. I'm not offering a cage. Aurelian turned to him fully. What are you offering? Cadron met his gaze, unflinching. Space, he said. Consistency, and a refusal to rush you into anything that requires you to shrink. The words were simple. They were also dangerous, because they came without a catch. Aurelian searched his face for expectation, for the subtle claim hidden behind generosity. He found none, just patience, active, deliberate, chosen. "Come with me," Cadron said, not command, not plea, not as a declaration, as a conversation that doesn't end tonight. Aurelian felt the old fear stir. The one that warned him safety always came with a bill. He let it surface without letting it decide. "Okay," he said. The answer felt like stepping onto solid ground. As they drove again, Aurelian realized something quietly astonishing. The dreams hadn't prepared him for this moment, they had prepared him to recognize it. And that, he understood now, was what real power sounded like. It didn't shout, it asked. Cadron's house didn't look like a promise. That was the first thing Aurelian noticed, and the first thing that let him breathe. It wasn't perched on a hill like a declaration, it didn't glow with glass or gates meant to impress. The place was quiet, set back from the road, lights warm and low like they expected people to come home tired rather than triumphant. Inside, nothing rushed to accommodate him, no staff appearing from nowhere, no tour offered as proof of worth, just a coat hook by the door, a bowl for keys, a hallway that didn't funnel him toward anything he hadn't agreed to see. "Guest room's down the hall," Cadron said. "Bathroom's yours, kitchen's open if you wake up hungry. Not my house, not my rules, just facts." Aurelian set his coat down carefully, like the movement itself mattered. His body hadn't decided yet whether this was temporary shelter or something he might choose to stay inside. He reminded himself that he didn't need to decide tonight. They sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea that steamed gently, not hot enough to demand attention. The quiet stretched, not thin, but wide. "You don't owe me gratitude," Cadron said, as if answering a thought Aurelian hadn't spoken. "And you don't owe your family forgiveness just because they share blood." Aurelian's fingers tightened around the mug. "They're already rewriting it," he said. "By tomorrow, the story will be about how they supported me, how they always knew I'd find someone." Cadron nodded. "They'll tell it that way until it feels true." "And if I don't correct them?" Aurelian asked. "Am I letting them get away with it?" Cadron considered him carefully. "You're allowed to choose distance instead of education," he said, "especially when education has never been offered in good faith." The words settled deep. For years, Aurelian had believed endurance was proof of maturity. That absorbing discomfort without complaint made him safe to be around. Hearing that he didn't owe clarity to people who used it as leverage felt like a small door opening somewhere inside him. "I don't want to punish them," Aurelian said. "I just don't want to belong to that version of myself anymore." "You don't," Cadron replied. "Belonging isn't retroactive." Later, alone in the guest room, Aurelian lay awake listening to the house breathe. No footsteps paused outside his door, no locks clicked into place. The absence of monitoring was louder than surveillance ever had been. He slept. Not deeply, not perfectly, but without the sharp edge of anticipation he'd grown used to. In the morning, he woke to sunlight instead of urgency. The dreams didn't come that night. Or maybe they did and dissolved into waking without leaving residue. Either way, the ache was quieter. Over the next days, Cadron did something that felt almost radical. He waited. He didn't ask Aurelian what he planned to do next. He didn't suggest timelines. He didn't frame staying as progress or leaving as failure. He offered meals, conversation, space. When Aurelian took a long walk alone, Cadron didn't check his phone. When Aurelian worked remotely from the dining table, Cadron moved around him without commentary, like presence didn't require management. Aurelian noticed how his body responded. The tension in his shoulders eased without him consciously releasing it. He stopped rehearsing explanations for choices he hadn't made yet. He laughed, soft, unguarded, at something ordinary and didn't immediately scan the room for judgment. On the third evening, his mother called. Aurelian watched the phone ring until it stopped. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt done. He told Cadron later, not as confession, just as fact. Cadron listened and nodded once. No advice, no validation baited with expectation. That night, Aurelian stood on the porch and watched the sky darken. The city felt far away, not because it was forbidden, but because he wasn't being pulled back by obligation. He realized then that something fundamental had shifted. Leaving hadn't been the hard part. Staying, without shrinking, without apologizing, without being made into a symbol, was the real choice. If you're still listening, ask yourself this. Have you ever been respected only after someone powerful stood beside you? And what did that teach you about how often your own voice was ignored before witnesses arrived? Aurelian closed his eyes and let the question exist without answering it yet. For the first time, the answer didn't feel urgent. It felt possible. The first thing Aurelian noticed was how little the house asked of him. It didn't demand routines disguised as care. It didn't reward obedience with warmth or punish hesitation with silence. Days unfolded without commentary, shaped more by light and appetite than expectation. If he slept late, nothing adjusted to shame him for it. If he woke early, the kitchen was simply there, quiet, stocked, indifferent in the best way. Safety, he realized, did not need to be loud. Kadrin moved through the space like someone who understood the difference between proximity and pressure. He was present without hovering, attentive without surveillance. When he worked fully. When he rested, he did so without apology. The house followed his rhythm not because it had to, but because it trusted it. Aurelian found himself matching that rhythm without trying. He took on small projects, organizing the spare room he'd claimed as a temporary office, cataloging old records Kadrin admitted he'd never had the patience to sort. The work felt grounding, familiar. Archival habits translated well to a life that valued attention over performance. One afternoon, while Aurelian sorted through a box of documents, he noticed something strange. Nothing in the house marked him as temporary. No guest tags, no subtle signals that this was borrowed space. The towels in the bathroom were his size. The mug Kadrin handed him in the mornings had quietly become his mug. A coat rack appeared near the back door after Aurelian mentioned once, casually, that he hated carrying things from room to room. No announcement. No, "I did this for you." Just accommodation. That unsettled him more than grand gestures ever could have. He brought it up over dinner, unable to leave the thought alone. "You make space very easily," he said. "Most people don't." Kadrin didn't look offended. He considered the comment like it mattered. "Space isn't scarce," he replied. "Control is. People confuse the two." Aurelian let the words settle. In the evenings, they talked, not about futures, not about labels, but about patterns, about how systems trained people to fear being unclaimed, about how dominance could be restraint instead of occupation, about how power often revealed itself in what it refused to take. Kadrin never framed himself as an answer. That mattered. One night, Aurelian dreamed again, but it was different. No separation, no interference, no reaching across distance. The alpha was there, familiar and calm, but the dream didn't pull at him. It didn't ache. It simply existed. When Aurelian woke, the dream dissolved easily, like something no longer needed for survival. He lay there for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, and felt something loosen inside his chest. The dreams weren't disappearing because he'd been claimed. They were quieting because he'd been held, by reality, not fantasy. Later that week, Aurelian tested the edges of his autonomy without announcing it. He took the train into the city alone, walked the old routes, sat in the cafe that had once been his refuge. No one stopped him. No one followed. When he returned, Kadrin asked only, "Did you enjoy it?" "Yes," Aurelian said, and meant it. That night, standing in the doorway of the guest room, Aurelian realized the truth he'd been circling for days. The house didn't feel like a cage because it wasn't trying to keep him. It felt like a place that trusted he would choose to stay or leave without being punished either way. That trust was heavier than obligation and far more powerful. Aurelian closed the door gently and lay down, the quiet around him unbroken. For the first time in years, waiting didn't feel like deferral. It felt like arrival. Aurelian didn't correct the story afterward. Families always rewrote endings to protect themselves. By the end of the week, the reunion had already been retold as a charming coincidence, how an impressive alpha had noticed Aurelian, how fate had finally intervened, how everyone had always known he would be fine. The laughter smoothed itself into nostalgia. The sharp edges were sanded down and packed away. Aurelian let them have it. Distance, he learned, could be an answer without being an argument. He didn't return calls framed as concern. He didn't respond to messages that treated his certainty like a phase. He didn't offer explanations for a life that had stopped asking permission to exist. Silence wasn't punishment. It was boundary. Life with Kadrin settled into something unremarkable in the best way. Mornings began without negotiation. Aurelian worked when his focus held and rested when it didn't. Cadron left early some days and returned late others, always the same when he came back. Present, attentive, uninterested in using absence as leverage. They cooked badly together and improved slowly. They shared space without narrating it. Nothing was claimed by default. When Cadron reached for Aurelian's hand the first time, it happened in a doorway, incidental, easy to release. He didn't hold on when Aurelian shifted. He didn't test the grip. He let contact be something that could exist and end without consequence. Aurelian noticed how his body responded, how calm arrived faster now, how the old flinch at expectation softened. He stopped scanning rooms for judgment. He stopped translating himself into something easier to accept. The quiet confidence that grew in him wasn't dramatic. It was structural. One evening, they walked along the river as dusk flattened the light. Aurelian watched the water move, steady and indifferent to deadlines. He realized the dreams had changed again. Not vanished, but simplified. When he slept now, they came rarely, and when they did, they felt less like messages and more like echoes. Memory, catching up. I used to think waiting meant something was wrong with me, Aurelian said, not looking at Cadron. Cadron kept pace beside him. Because they needed you to believe that. Aurelian nodded. If I'd rushed, I would have been praised for being realistic. If I'd been hurt, they would have called it maturity. And now? Cadron asked. Now I think waiting was the most honest thing I did, Aurelian replied. I just didn't have language for it. They stopped at the railing. Cadron didn't lean in. He rested his forearms lightly, leaving space without emphasizing it. Aurelian closed the gap on his own. I don't want to be chosen because someone else needed proof, Aurelian said. I want to be chosen because I'm already standing. Cadron turned to him then. You are, he said, and I'm not here to put you somewhere else. The simplicity of it landed like a promise that didn't need to be sworn. Weeks passed. The city learned new rhythms. People found new stories to repeat. Aurelian's name appeared less often in conversations designed to classify him. That, too, was a kind of freedom. One afternoon, he returned to the archives where he worked. Not to announce anything, just to feel the familiar order of shelves and catalog numbers. A colleague greeted him warmly, asked about his time away without prying. Aurelian realized he no longer needed to guard the narrative. The work spoke for him. His steadiness did too. That night, he dreamed again. The alpha was there, as always, but the dream didn't ask him to follow. It didn't ache or pull. The alpha looked at him with the same recognition as before, then stepped aside, leaving Aurelian in a space that felt fully his. When Aurelian woke, the dream dissolved without residue. He smiled. Later, standing in the kitchen, he caught his reflection in the window again. 30 years old. Same face, same hands, different posture. He wasn't late. He was precise. Cadron entered quietly and set 2 cups of tea on the counter. No announcement, no ceremony, just the small, repeatable acts that made life durable. No one owns you, Cadron said, as if finishing a thought that had been hanging between them since the first night. Not your family, not the story, not even me. Aurelian met his gaze. I know, he said, and the knowing didn't frighten him anymore. They stood there in companionable silence while the kettle cooled and the house settled. Outside, the world continued doing what it always did, measuring worth with shortcuts, mistaking speed for clarity. Inside, Aurelian felt the rarest kind of peace, the kind that arrived when you stopped arguing with your own timing. If you're still listening, ask yourself this, without flinching. If waiting didn't break you, what would you stop apologizing for? And who might you become if you trusted the pace that kept you intact? Aurelian took his tea and moved toward the window, not to look out, but to stand comfortably where he was. Some dreams, he understood now, weren't promises of what you lacked. They were memories of what you already knew, arriving late enough for you to recognize them and early enough to change everything.